Well, welcome to our first class, and I'm joined by Ron. Thank you, Ron, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, you're known for many things, a podcaster, an architect of shake, and for this fine tome, The Art and Science of Digital Compositing, now in its second edition.
This is the new version. It's significantly heavier than the old one.
Actually, what's really terrific about it is that for a subject matter that obviously deals heavily with visuals, now you're able to pepper through in every relevant chapter a whole lot of...
Well, yeah, that's really the biggest difference between the first edition is this one was, back in the day, color printing was expensive, and so I had a limited number, if you remember, it was just color inserts in a few places, and I really had to pick and choose what I could show in color, and consequently there was a bunch of stuff that I just couldn't show. If I only had black and white illustrations to talk about color, it was difficult. So yeah, this is, nowadays it's full color all the way through, and a lot of the work I did, a significant portion of the work I did for this one was go out and shoot some reference examples and different pieces that better illustrated the concept. So,
well, the other really good thing is the amount of case studies in the latter part of the book, because they're not case studies from obscure films I've never heard of. They're actually terrific examples from blockbuster.
Yeah, we got some very big name stuff. I mean, part of the reason why there's so many is getting permission to use case studies is such a hassle. I went ahead and approached a lot of people thinking that, 3/4 of them would drop out, and we ended up actually getting quite a few of them. It took forever and a lot of permissions. But yeah, I think probably the back, almost third of the book or so is case studies, from there on back.
Yeah, plus there's a DVD in the back that has a whole lot of plate stuff that's terrific.
We got some sample footage, some courtesy of you, and a variety of different things from that. But we also were able to get actual footage from some Star Wars material. ILM was good enough, and Lucasfilm was good enough to get us that. So there's, that's a gold mine. There's actually the entire shot on there, on the DVD in the back of the book.
Oh, it's excellent. But we're actually not going to be delving deeply into the case studies. We'll obviously touch on them. But what we wanted to do was cover, really the art and science of compositing. But compositing itself is only part of the picture, and in fact only part of the visual effects picture at that. So let's place the context of where compositing sits, and certainly the scope of what we're going to be talking about in terms of the overall production. So let's assume for this discussion anyway, we're talking about a major theatrical feature film. How do we sort of think of compositing in that environment?
Well, I've always thought of compositing as where it all comes together. I mean, literally, but also in terms of the workflow of a production. There's all the different CG pieces that get generated, or the stage work that gets you the guys on the blue screens. But the compositor is the guy that's putting the final pieces together, that's doing the finish on it. And I think that's only going to continue to be true. I think the lines are blurring a bit, and that compositing is maybe going to be considered generally part of the digital finish on a film. Where's that line between the compositing stage versus the color grading is an interesting question. But yeah, it's the guy that's doing the composite is really the person that's putting together the pieces, that's making the shot, and I kind of feel like that's a critical piece. You can't have a good shot without having a good compositor putting it together, and so that's why it's always been interesting to me. When I started off in the business, I actually came from more of a 3D background, but when I really started doing production in the film world, I ended up gravitating toward compositing just because it felt like that's where you can make the most difference. That's where you can save a shot. That's where you can make a good shot great. Yeah,
even if we talk about stereoscopic filming for a second, where you're filming with two cameras, it doesn't matter if you're filming with two cameras, filming with one. The fact of the matter is if you're shooting live action, you're going to get a two-dimensional slice put on a piece of film, put on a sensor, and so you're inherently starting with 2D.
Yeah, it's 2D shots if you're doing stereo, but it's still back to a compositing kind of an environment, an image manipulation sort of scenario.
Now, clearly, if you're doing a fully digital film, it would be possible to pretty much nail that in the render and produce, for all intents and purposes, a finished shot, though while it's dramatically less how much compositing is used on fully animated films, it still is actually quite cost-effective to do it, isn't it?
More so than ever, I've been talking to a lot of the big facilities for years and years and years, and I remember back in the day when even Pixar was fully, render everything, and that's no longer the case. They've seen the benefit of having things broken up into smaller pieces, and there's so many reasons to do that. I've worked on, much lower budget animated features, and especially for a scenario like that, the cost savings you can have by rendering in layers and putting it together in the composite. It gives you, it saves you on render time. It gives you more flexibility to put stuff together. It pushes the finish a little bit further down in the pipeline and ultimately to a lower cost portion of it. And it gives you more flexibility. It gives you the ability to go in and make creative decisions later in the process and switch things around, which is always, that's what every director wants, right? They want to be able to change their mind up to the last minute. That's the nature of the beast. And so by moving stuff more into the compositing phase, it gives them the ability to do that, and ultimately, I think, gives them more creative freedom.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because it used to be that the cushiest job in the world was being a compositor at Pixar, because they didn't actually have to composite very much. But
well, yeah, it started off being, just little effectsy stuff. I mean, that's typically where they started. There's a case study in the book here that talks about some work on The Incredibles, where it was just sort of a fire effect that they had done. They did not do a whole lot of compositing on that film, but then as you move toward the more recent stuff, especially something like WALL-E, tons more compositing going on in there.
Yeah, and the other thing is that when we're thinking about integrating things and working stuff up, there are two approaches that we can take even with 3D. The first is to get the elements from 3D, obviously, as looking like pretty much standard pictures, and then place them in whatever environment, be it virtual or real. The second, and we'll get into this much later, is the whole idea of what happens in a 3D program is that the 3D program effectively produces layers internally, doesn't it?
Exactly. You've got, the components of the way light interacts with an object is broken down inside of the renderer anyway. There's the ambient, the diffuse, the specular components, and a variety of other things as well. Subsurface scattering, if you're doing skins, any of those pieces. And sure, you could have your renderer composite these things together, and that's really all it's doing, is it's building up the different lighting models and then combining them to make an image.
In fact, that's why it can be cheap to do multi-pass, as we call it, compositing, the sense that instead of taking the fully sort of formed 3D picture and placing it in our environment, we actually ask for all those layers. That doesn't cost me more render time, because in fact what we're really doing is, rather than saying render out this pass, render out this pass, render out this pass, and composite it, we actually go into the 3D box, as it were, open the lid and say, look, before you put those together, give me all your elements and I'll do it later.
Let me do it.
Yeah.
I'll worry about that part of it. Yeah, and like I said, it gives you more flexibility. And the other thing it gives you is, if just one layer needs to be redone or there's a problem with that, it's much faster to just recreate one piece of it. But it gives the artist more control over that. I really see, and you're seeing this at a lot of facilities, that the discipline of compositing, the artistic skill of a compositor is actually very similar to what you have for a lighter, somebody that's lighting a scene. And we're seeing that at a number of facilities where they've just decided that final finishing phase, where it's compositing and color and lighting, are kind of growing together. And because it really is the important part of the skill set, the eye, the ability to see what does it take for something to be integrated into a scene, for it to be lit appropriately for what the scene is. And so, yeah, I think you're only going to see more of that, where the person that's putting the final color lighting together is effectively doing compositing. And the title of your book and the nature of the beast is that it isn't just a technical process. It isn't just about being mathematically accurate in how A goes over B to generate C, because we're in the movie industry, we're in the entertainment industry. If we're not, at best, you could broaden it out for some categories and say we're in the communication business, but pretty much we're not talking about scientific visualization. So it isn't so much an accuracy thing we're aiming at, it's just a quality of the final work. Yeah, somewhere in there, several times I think I make the statement that if it looks correct, it is correct. Bottom line is, it boils down to an aesthetic decision. And often that won't necessarily be 100% scientifically accurate, but real filmmaking isn't 100% scientific. There's all kinds of unmotivated lights. We're sitting here talking, and there's a couple of lights that happen to be set up, and talking behind the scenes stuff here. There's lights that we set up to make the environment different than what the real world would have, and much more so on a film set, where everything is, you're trying to get an interesting look on the characters. So it's not trying to be 100% accurate. Now, as a compositor, what you're trying to be is 100% faithful to the vision that was established by the director of photography. But in that context, you're trying to be accurate to a particular scenario.
And one concept we're going to discuss a lot is the whole idea of something being filmic. And I guess the thing to say is that if you look at stills that someone takes, and I know you're an avid photographer, you wouldn't say that everybody's photos look cinematic.
Right.
So there's a whole art to not just capturing it, not just faithfully reproducing it. I mean, I could produce a photo from a series of layers, composited together in a state-of-the-art compositing package, and it still wouldn't look cinematic or in any way filmic in the way that we think of it in terms of the entertainment industry?
Yeah, and a lot of that, of course, goes back to lighting. As a still photographer, I would love to be able to, as I'm on location in whatever interesting foreign country I'm in or something, to have a whole set of lights where I could run out and relight the Taj Mahal and try to get a better key versus fill ratio or something like that. But that's what you have inside of a film, where you can go in and you can choose to light something to tell a story. To change around what's in the real world versus something that's more dramatic or more filmic, if you want.
Well, let's talk about some of these properties of our perceptive system, because if we are acknowledging that we're going for a filmic look and we're trying to push the buttons that get a certain response from the audience, we should, I guess, start with our just visual mechanism for reading things. And I think the problem here is we tend to intellectualize the process a little when we're examining it. We tend to think in terms of things that we know to be true, and that isn't necessarily what we're seeing, is it?
No, the eye is a funny thing. It's so tied into the brain, and I think we don't even know yet where that interface exactly is, and how much of what your brain is seeing is just making up reality. There's in the book itself, one thing I did in this version versus the first edition was to move the chapter called Learning to See up to the front of the book. It had been sort of buried. In the original edition of the book, I had put a lot of the technical stuff up front, how is our images stored and that kind of thing. And I realized that that's not the way that people tend to approach this or should be approaching this. The important stuff is looking at all of the technical issues with that initial visual thing in mind. So I moved the Learning to See chapter up front, and it gave me room to do a lot of examples of how does the real world look, how do things react. But there's a great example in that first chapter, a diagram done by, I think it was Professor Edelman at MIT, that shows a couple of different scenes it shows a scene with an object casting a shadow on a checkerboard pattern.
I love this shot, because in this shot, my mind says that those squares must be the same, because I understand that it's a checkerboard image. So looking at the shot, I'm like, well, yeah, they have to be. And of course, then, as you point out in the book,
the area in shadow that you see here is, because it's a checkerboard, you think that's a different color from the area that's out of shadow, or that's offset from the checkerboard. But in reality, it's the same color. But you will, I can look at that. And I've looked at that image thousands of times, and every time I go out and do a presentation, I put that one up there to show, and everybody in the room will insist that these are two different colors. But if you really boil it down, you can, digitally look at the values and see that.
If we take that image and just start removing things from the shot, and we're not digitally adjusting the shot here in any way, not color grading it, just slowly remove things from the shot, till we're only left with those two samples of colour just by fading it away here. You can see they are actually the same colour. Now, it looks like at some point in that exercise we colour corrected. But
nothing has changed there. It's just, this is just moving it's really removing all the pieces that are fooling the brain. It's removing the context, which is what our brain uses to understand what's going on there. In this case, the context is I've got an object that's casting a shadow onto a surface, and we immediately compensate for that. We mentally dial in the sense that these must be different colors because this is what we're seeing inside of the shadow. But in reality, our eyes are completely fooled by what we see there.
Yeah, if we take another shot, say a shot of a car that's like a red car, then most people, if they looked at that shot, would say that's a red car. Is the car the same color overall? Well, yeah. That car is red.
Right.
I know it to be red. It's all red. It's the same coloured red.
Right.
Whereas, in fact, the range of tonal values we're getting on a car is insane.
Yeah, and it's all about the light in the scene interacting with it. But our brain has a sense of what is an object and makes assumptions about what it's seeing based on this sort of perception, since we've been an infant of how the real world exists, and compensates for that.
Now, in the world of visual effects, we've relied on that quite a lot. If we go back old school for a second, the idea of forced perspective and things all relied on our inability to kind of see past that and trick our minds.
And if you've ever been on a set with a forced perspective miniature setup, it's an amazing experience because you immediately start walking around it trying to understand what your brain is seeing. Forced perspective will build stuff in the distance at different scales that are inappropriate to what would what's for the normal for the scene, but fools your eye into thinking that there's more depth in the scene because of that. It's a great, it's something that we don't necessarily have to do in CG anymore, but when you see that in real life, it's amazing to see how your brain tries to interpret that. And, you get into the right position, and you will swear that the depth of the scene is different than what it is.
Yeah, and we want to complete the scene. We want it to make logical sense in our head. So if something's put in there in the old days, they used to hang in a piece of glass with a painting to do a set extension. And we want it to be the same thing in our head conceptually. So it's easy enough to kind of extend the line and see it. And almost, while we think that we can see into a visual effect really well, and of course on bad ones we often do, still it's sort of hard sometimes going the other way, to break your eye when looking at a shot. And that's, I think, what we've been talking about, the idea of your eye, to see what is really there as opposed to doing it. And I'll give you a good example. We shot green screen and somebody left a water bottle right in the middle of set. I'm not talking like at the edge. I mean right on the middle of the green screen.
Yep.
And I was staring at that green screen for the first 3 takes. Is it even green? Is it, right?
Yep.
Not once did I notice in the middle of shot a water bottle. And I mean, I wouldn't have believed it had not someone said, "Hey, what's that water bottle doing there?" And I was like, "Oh my god!"
You don't. There are definitely things that you don't see because you're not looking for that. There's this classic example online. Maybe we can find some of this of people playing basketball, and you're given the instruction to count how many times somebody passes the basketball between people wearing a certain colored shirt, and you very much focus on that, and you're sitting there, you're doing your counting. And completely ignore really what else is going on there. And then if you go back and are told, what really happened in the scene, you will swear you didn't see it.
Extraordinary.
Which is, and it's amazing. And then, once you're done counting and all that, and you can ask the people that watch this, did you see anything strange, anything out of the ordinary? And the answer is generally no. And then you go back and play it from again and point out the fact that a man in a gorilla suit had walked through the middle of the scene, I think even pounded on his chest and then continued walking. But your eye's not looking for that. You're focusing on something else, and that's really the trick that a good effects artist tries to use. It's not about necessarily getting everything perfect in the scene. It's about making sure there's nothing that pulls your eye away from the important part of it.
And getting to visual effects for a second, that's relevant also in the idea of a magician. Now, magicians obviously use misdirection, and we're kind of used to that concept. But more than once, I've certainly in a shot tried to make the audience look here, or assumed that they would be paying attention at this point in the shot. And I've actually done the visual effect earlier. So, for example, if I wanted to swap out and do a cut, an impossible edit, so that the same person can be in the same shot twice. If you do that edit when neither person's on screen and it's happened, they're not paying attention.
Yep.
Now the person appears for the second time. Everyone's looking, is he keyed? Is he being composited in there?
Yeah.
And of course, it's 100% live action by that point. But you just naturally sort of have used the magician's trick of when no one was noticing, that's when the switcheroo happened, and further.
The best visual effects supervisors that I've worked with, inevitably that's the difference you see between a really experienced good effects supervisor and one that's inexperienced or hasn't done much time with it, is the good ones will say, nobody's looking there, we don't need to spend time on that, whereas the inexperienced ones tend to focus on something down in the corner of the screen that maybe it doesn't look quite right, but nobody should be looking there. And things have changed a little bit these days, relative to back when DVDs didn't exist. Back in the day, you could certainly make the assumption that somebody was not going to stop this thing, slow-mo, go through frame by frame. So the rules have changed a little bit, but still I think the basic concept of focusing attention, it goes beyond the sense of making sure the shot looks good. It goes really to the heart of it, which is making sure the story is told, and that you need to focus your attention. And again, it's the same thing that the director of photography is doing, and the actors themselves are doing, which is making sure that the viewer's direction, the viewer's attention is directed in the proper part of what's going on.
Yeah, and I mean, as you say, it can be as simple as people are going to be looking at the hand interaction of a person touching a digital furry animal. And so everyone's attention is on the hand. And so instead of trying to comp in the digital with the hand, you actually replace the entire arm.
Yeah.
And so the seam line is up at the shoulder. Everybody's staring down here going,
trying to figure out how they work the split line there.
How did they get the fur to go through the finger? Yeah, exactly, and it's fully replaced.
Yep.
So in many respects, notwithstanding the artist that would do the final grading of the film, the compositor is the person where it really comes together, isn't it? That's the sort of last chance to make it work. And yes, there is some work done in grading after that, but pretty much as a compositor, it's important to understand how the eye works, also understand where the audience is in terms of what they're watching, and then work out ways of designing things to basically trick an audience.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting to talk about color grading because that has sort of pushed, at one point there was a lot of that work is being done by the compositor, particularly if you had a sequence that was all effect shots. And, there was a period of time in there where you tended to be doing still photochemical grading, but there was a lot of digital work being done. You may have had an entire sequence that was digital just due to the fact that every shot was an effect shot. And at that point, you would find the compositing artist dealing with sort of tuning in the color as well. The compositing artist still has to be able to deliver something that is consistent across the other shots, and then the colorist then will take and sort of put a finished look on everything. But if the compositing artist is delivering something that's widely divergent from the other shots, a colorist can only go so far in fixing that and trying to bring stuff together. So it's still up to the compositor to make sure that they are consistent and provide something to the color grader that's going to work in the scene.
Yeah, I think that point about consistency is really good because it used to be that you could pick a visual effects shot because it was almost telegraphed by the fact that we'd suddenly lock off the camera and set up an environment that was not in the style of the cinematography that the DOP had established in every other shot. Mm-hmm. And so, as we'll discuss next week, the whole idea of moving images and the style and everything else really plays into selling a shot. It isn't just about making a still work. I mean,
and that's really, again, what I tried to get through here is that you are an artist and you've got to understand the artistic vision of the film. You've got to understand that you're not producing a shot in isolation. You're producing something that is part of the bigger whole, and there's a vision by the director of photography and a vision by the director that you have to be a part of that. You have to buy into that, and you have to be providing the pieces. It's very much a collaborative effort.
So let's talk about the science side of it now. And back in the day, as you referred to it earlier, it was pretty simple. You had effectively colour that was limited to a certain palette. That was what you worked in, and that was not dissimilar to the colour palette you would see at home when you switch on your television set. And by that I'm referring to kind of 8-bit or video colour. These days we have a huge range of technical stuff that we'll be getting into later in the classes, but it has opened up an enormous amount with HDR, 32-bit, floating point, all of these formats, and there is absolutely the need to pay attention to this stuff because you can be defeated on a shot because things just technically didn't carry through properly.
In terms of technical discussions, that's one of the things that really changed with this book is the first edition, which was published in '99 or so, kind of approached everything from the workflow perspective of 16 bits, 16-bit per channel workflow. And it was clear that I needed to update throughout the book the sense that at a high-end facility these days, most places are not working in 16-bit. They're working in floating point. They're dealing with 32 bits per channel, but more importantly, they're dealing with the sense that there's a bigger dynamic range in the scene. We've always kind of dealt with that in the film world because a piece of film negative is able to capture a much wider dynamic range than what is going to be projected. So, everybody that's worked with film is familiar with this idea that there's stuff above what we're defining as white, and we can call it super wide or whatever you want to call it, but it's really the sense of getting a bigger dynamic range. If you look at any scene, something like this where we're indoors and there's light coming in, but there's also deep shadows, there's a lot of change in what's the brightest area versus the darkest area. And in some scenes, particularly some outdoor scenes where you've got heavy, bright sunlight and really deep shadows somewhere, there's a huge dynamic range that you're dealing with there.
Even in this setup here, we've actually had to put ND gels, in other words, neutral density filters that darken the light without affecting its colour over the glass before we lowered the curtains, because otherwise, right now, over your shoulder would be just white.
Yes, so you got something blown out here, and then your shirt would be so dark there'd be no detail in it. And
so we've kind of lit it to limit down our range. But in the world of compositing, we need to take into account a lot of these things because it's not even just the dynamic range. Many of us have to deal with compression, with formats, with bit depth in cooperation with what those compression techniques are and when they are. And it actually has become perhaps a more moving target than it was a while ago, because no longer is it as simple as the end destination is just one kind of goalpost. That darn sucker keeps moving.
Well, and people should be really thinking to the future where our display technologies are going to get better too. We're going to look back on all these movies that were done today, and there's still going to be this problem of it may not be well suited to future display technology where you can have a bigger dynamic range. You can sit in the theater and the sun can be so bright that it hurts your eyes, and but you can still pan over and see, look into the shadows and see detail in there. So I think people that are producing films these days need to be thinking about the fact that conceivably they're not doing enough right now to produce a range of data, a range of dynamic range relative to what's going to be out there in the future.
And it isn't possible to get a shot looking correct unless you have matched resolution, matched film grain, matched, a lot of these different technical aspects. That you can be, have your perspective lines work and it still look like it's stuck on there. Mm-hmm. And I hear that quite a lot. It looks like it's stuck in there. It doesn't look like it sits. And so as much as we applaud the art, the science is also very, very valid.
You need to approach everything with a sense of understanding the technical side of things, of being able to produce something that is technically correct. And then once you've done that, and once you're sure that you've nailed something technically, then you can choose, you can make the decision to deviate from that for artistic purposes. But the bottom line is you really need to understand sort of what is and again, it's not necessarily, it's being technically correct within the context of the scene and within the context of what you're doing. So, I make a point in here somewhere in that beginning chapter of Learning to See, it's not even necessarily about emulating the way you see a scene, but it's emulating the way a camera lens sees a scene, because that's what the rest of the footage surrounding it is. It's not something that you're looking at directly. It's something it's a world you're viewing through a camera lens. And so all the different aspects of that come along with the aberration that you can have in a lens, chromatic aberration or lens flares or anything. Yep, all of those different pieces are, again, something that needs to be understood and probably emulated to match what's in the rest of the scene.
You've been involved with a range of products for compositing, from Shake, obviously, as you're very well known for, but you've also been involved with Nuke, and you've obviously seen and worked with a huge variety of systems. I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that while technology has moved forward, it hasn't necessarily made it technically simpler. It's just meant that the technical possibilities have expanded almost in a direct inverse proportion.
I think part of it is we were always compromising with the older tools. We were doing our best. There was a lot of reliance on the artists being able to do exactly those magic tricks that we were talking about, of sort of hiding the problems or getting around the problems or making compromises based on the knowledge that what was eventually going to be projected had limitations. But as we get more and more into it, we are getting better tools and faster machines. We can be more technically accurate. And yeah, sometimes that takes more effort to do it. And then I think the other piece of it is just directors are getting more ambitious too, and we've gotten to the point where they feel they can toss anything your way, and you can compensate for it, and we can. I mean, we can, given time and money, we can pretty much do anything these days.
But I guess the trick about getting the technical stuff right is that it's increasingly crushing the schedules that we're given, and so getting it right and knowing what you're doing. I mean, there isn't really a lot of time to fluff around and bump around in the dark here. We need to kind of have a path forward, because on any major production now, the process, the sort of pipeline, the engineering of the steps is almost as difficult and complex a problem as any one individual technical aspect.
Yeah, it's getting all the pieces together, and the problem has gotten harder because, like I said, people are accustomed to now sitting in front of their DVD and looking at it frame by frame. So there's definitely less room for error as well.
Well, next week we'll kick off with a discussion about the process and exactly what a modern film pipeline looks like at sort of precise level, where we actually sit in that. And we also want to start discussing on-set stuff to do with lenses, as you mentioned, and also what you need to do on set to do things and to get them through. And that on-set stuff will come through pretty much in Class 3, and then as we move forward in 4 and 5 and stuff, we'll start discussing keying, and then hopefully by the end of it, we'll have a good, complete picture of the underlying principles. But I think it's safe to say we're not going to try and focus on any one app. We're not going to try and focus on any one implementation. And for all your sort of recognised architectural experience, the book is actually fairly agnostic when it comes to
intentionally
discussing.
so, because it didn't do me any good to write a manual for how to use a particular piece of software. Software comes and goes. That's certainly been proven the case. I've lived through it myself. And what I always say, it's knowing why you press the buttons, not what buttons to press. And that's really what I try to do. Is I feel that if you give somebody a foundation for what's the concepts behind it, if you know all this, learning how to use a particular app is easy. It's just a matter of taking time, doing a mental mapping from what you know needs to be done versus how a particular tool does it.
I must admit, my favourite thing was having pulled off an all-nighter, doing the most astonishing exercise in getting a baby to do something that a baby should not be able to do, and it was just, I was really pleased with it. I finally polished this shot, hadn't slept for days, but it was something I could be proud of, and the client turned to me and said, God, this box is good.
Yep, that's exactly it. Same thing you see with a photographer, where you go out and you take some great pictures and somebody says, you must have a really good camera.
Well, on that note, we'll leave you for this week, and we'll pick you up next week. Ron, I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion, and thank you again for joining us.
Looking forward to it.